So I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. My mother and father were born and raised there, and I grew up there. The biggest thing that struck me was at the beginning of the film when it said that St. Louis was the #1 city for crime in the country. That broke my heart. I grew up in a St. Louis where you literally could leave your doors open, leave your car doors unlocked. You could actually leave your wallet and your keys in your car and nobody would bother it. Like, it really was straight up like something out of a movie.
I want to go back there.
You know, I was going to ask you, you never grew up in that kind of St. Louis, did you?
What area did you go?
I grew up all over the place because my dad was in the Marine Corps. My mother and father were born and raised there. So we would stay there for a minute, then we'd leave, then we'd come back, then we'd leave, then we'd come back. But I lived in North St. Louis. I lived in South St. Louis. I lived all over St. Louis.
My 34 years, we ain't never been able to leave our doors open or none of that.
That makes me so sad, so sad. How did you guys become aware of Bruce?
I read a lot, and I read a lot of local papers and Reddit threads and things like that, and I came across a newspaper article about Bruce that was like a profile, and it had a video where he sort of spoke a little bit about his background and his philosophy and his approach to community leadership and things like that. I mean, first and foremost, was extremely captivated by his story and the way that it challenged a lot of, I think, people's preconceived notions about young black men. I mean, I remember there was one interview when I started researching a little bit more. I think someone just assumed that he spent time in prison, and he's like, no, actually, I haven't been in prison, and I'm married, and I have, kids and things like that. I think what he was doing was really captivating, especially in 2017, 2018, when everything political felt so hopeless and angering that he sort of just felt somebody who deserved a larger bullhorn to talk about his message. And for me, it just really started from there. And I sent Sami the article, and we talked about it, and I said, I'm going to try to get in touch with this guy and see if there's something that he wants to tell, something that's going on in his life. We didn't have any particular story in mind or any objective, any kind of narrative that we were trying to fill in telling the story. We just wanted to get a hold of him and see, like, what if you had the attention of tens of millions of people, like, what would you want to tell them about yourself and your life and about St. Louis, about Ferguson, about black men and all of that. And that's where really things originated. It took a while getting the calls back.
I think, like, just because she won't talk about this, but just to hit on Smriti's tenacity and just doggedness and pursuing Bruce, like, she really fought for the story with the producers of the project, also convinced Bruce to let us in, and I think that's like an important part of it, that Bruce opening his door to us. The project would be nothing without those two things. Bruce just like totally understanding what we were doing and taking a leap of faith to believe that we weren't interested in exploiting or doing a kind of tabloid thing, but film about really just a father and a son.
Bruce may have a totally different perspective on all of
Yeah.
Like, these crazy people wouldn't leave me alone, so I had to make a film.
How did you feel when these two filmmakers came to you and they were like, we read your story, we think it's really interesting, we'd like to do a film about it? What was the first thing that ran across your mind when they contacted you?
That it was like every other person who kind of hit us up about doing stuff about Ferguson or the work we were doing. Unfortunately, I kind of just put them in a box because I had some bad experiences with films, with people making films. Smriti is the best type of stalker. She found me on Facebook. She found me on Twitter, email, whatever means it took. And so finally, my assistant, who is my closest friend, I told her, I'm like, look, check them out. If you say do it, then I'm going to do it. Because she watches a lot of documentaries. She's really informed. So I was like, I'm going to leave it up to you. Whatever Smith said to her, she called me back ASAP and was like, if you don't do nothing else, you have to get with these people. And so when they came in, the first time it was just supposed to be kind of like a conversation and, us hang out, get to know each other, which kind of, let my guard down too, because most folks don't come to you like that when they're trying to get something done. And I could tell that it was genuine. When I met them, they made me comfortable. They made me feel like this was a film being done not because of anything else outside of, letting somebody tell a story that needs to be told, not just for the community in St. Louis, but the entire community, all the communities that look like ours around the nation. And so they had this platform and they were willing to tell my story. They were willing to let me tell my story. That was the most important part of it.
This story warmed my heart for a variety of reasons. It's really good to know that someone like yourself has decided to not sit back on the sidelines and complain, because what happens nowadays, especially in the culture and the climate that we're living in, is a lot of people will sit back and complain, give get amongst their groups or their peers and constituents and discuss what's going on in our world, but very few people take it a step further and step up and do something about it. So I applaud you for not sitting on the sidelines and getting fed up to the point where you decided to do something about it, running for Congress, getting a seat, and passing a bill. Can you talk to me briefly about what the bill is that you had passed and what was the impetus behind that? For people that haven't seen the film, which is going to be playing at the AFI Docs, I would like for you to tell them a little bit about that.
The bill has three different parts to it. It's a House concurrent resolution with the clause to act, so that means that it's an actual bill. But we had to do it that way because it had three different subjects. One is it identifies youth violence as a public health epidemic. So Missouri now identifies youth violence as a public health epidemic so that we can get more grant funding, more money from the federal government as well to speak to the root causes of gun violence and everything that's tied in with the root causes of gun violence. The CDC had already made violence public health epidemic, but they never did youth violence because they clumped it all together. By us doing that, we would be able to get more funds, more resources. Second part is it encourages our educational system to use trauma-informed training for our teachers, because we have teachers that come from places like Teach for America and all these places where they mean well and they want to do great work, but they just don't come from our community. So they come with this cookie-cutter approach to kids who have barriers and feel like, okay, well, this is what should be done in order for them to be successful, but they don't even understand what they're going through each and every day before they get to school and after they leave school. It's just basically encouraging our education system to do trauma-informed training. The third and most important to me personally is that identifies June 7th as Christopher Harris Day, named after my brother who was killed in 1991. When he was 9 years old, he was used as a human shield. And when my brother was killed, it sparked the first ever gun buyback and removed like 7,000 guns from the streets. But it's a day of advocacy to talk about youth violence, to talk about gun violence prevention and violence prevention as a whole when it comes down to young people.
I'm so excited that there's someone like you in Congress. You're a regular, ordinary dude. You're a rapper. You're an activist. You're a dad. And now you're a state rep. I'm so excited for you. And I'm so excited to see what's going to come out for you next in terms of legislation and your role in politics in the state of Missouri. This is for all three of you guys, actually. I want to know what your thoughts are regarding our government having so much energy toward immigration and not enough energy toward banning guns. Because last week, yet again, we had another school shooting.
Yep. Sammy and I have a lot of thoughts about that.
I think we've gone so far where money just dominates politics, and it's so rare to get politicians and public officials who actually represent the people. That's the reason, is because the NRA is such a huge lobby, and why what Bruce was able to do in the Missouri House so incredible, because here's, Mr. Smith goes to Washington, Mr. Franks goes to Jefferson City. That's what the story is. This guy is like a regular guy with deep ties to his community. And Bruce's success, I think, can be a model for other politicians. And you see it now with a new wave, a new generation of leaders in Washington, D.C., but more people should pay attention to how Bruce was able to build connections, not just with Democrats, but Republicans, too. You can look to see how Bruce is able to cut through the clutter and the noise, which is what the media and, powerful interests want you to do. They just want you to hear the noise and not feel so helpless that you can't do anything. But Bruce is able to cut through that and kind of inspire people and also just get stuff done. So that's what I think. I think that it's money, it's noise, but, at the end of the day, we have to move forward for the things that we know are right. And people should pay attention to what Bruce is doing and what he's done.
I think that's a really good assessment. Everything in this country comes down to the almighty dollar. I mean, let's just keep it real. And how it's spent and who has it. That's just the way it is. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. But very few politicians put their money where their mouth is or put back into the community what they say. They give a lot of empty promises when they're running. And then once they're in, they usually, make it their business to answer all of the people that got them in there, the ones with the pocketbooks that got them in there. So I applaud you and appreciate appreciate you and respect you, Bruce, for putting your money where your mouth is, not walking around with empty promises. You walking the walk and you talking the talk. And as somebody that is a native of St. Louis and the state of Missouri, I appreciate that. So thank you.
I appreciate it.
That's great. Yeah, I think, sorry, Bruce, let me just jump in. One final thought for me, but I think we have to have Bruce's back, because it takes a lot to not only take on special interests on the other side of the aisle, but special interests on your own side of the aisle. And that's where people of conscience need to understand that Bruce put himself on the line, and we need to have his back too.
I got your back. That's why I'm interviewing you. All I needed to see in the title was St. Louis. I'm like, yep, I'm in. I am in.
I wanted to add something to what Sami said. Two things, actually. One is, I think that actually it doesn't really come down to the almighty dollar, because it's not in anybody's financial interest to keep immigrants out of this country or regulate women's bodies or, any of the other things. I mean, I think ultimately it comes down to put it bluntly, white people in power acting in the interest to keep white, blaming everybody but white men for everything that's wrong in society, whether it's women, whether it's trans people, LGBTQ people, whether it's Black community, immigrants, whatever it is, the blame for anything that's wrong in society shifts everywhere but towards white men. That's honestly how I feel. As we've seen in this last week with the tariffs and this and that, it's in nobody's financial interest to do what we're doing with immigration. And then just in terms of what Sami was saying about people like us who, have a lot of privilege to really have the backs of people like Bruce who are putting themselves out there to make change. One of the things that really struck me, over the course of making the film and seeing, what happened in 2018 with the elections then, is that people like Bruce and this sort of first wave, even someone like Ilhan Omar and some of, Rashida Tlaib and some of the other the freshman congressmen who are congresspersons who are taking office now, they're part of a first wave of people who don't come from political dynasties, who are not older white men and have been groomed for politics their whole life, taking a seat at the table. We always talk about how thrilling that is and how exciting and how it sparks hope, but it also comes at a cost, and I think can't really be ignored either. One of the things that we talked to Bruce about early on and really struck us early on in telling his story was the fact that he had to every day sort of rip open his deepest wounds, his deepest trauma to do his job. And for the sake of everyone else, explaining to people on the opposite side of the aisle or to get resources for his community, he had to really sort of put himself out there. And I think he could speak to this. I won't speak for him, but I think that takes a toll. Sometimes there are other ways for people of color and women especially to influence what happens in our own communities, in our own neighborhood, outside of politics. And I think that's just as important, community activism and being open with your story. I think these are ways also to sort of shift these dynamics, besides just running for office. Running for office is great, if you can do it and if you have the resources and the skill to do it, like Bruce did, I think it's amazing. But there's lots of ways to sort of change, what's happening at a national and local level. And it also, holding, being a public figure, especially when you come from marginalized community, comes at a deep cost, and we also have to be sympathetic to that when we talk about it, not hold them up as heroes, but also really recognize when stuff gets really difficult.
Absolutely. And I agree with you. One thing I did want to point out is that not all political dynasties and cities are white men. In St. Louis, the political dynasty that lives in St. Louis and has dominated the political scene there is the Clay family. Generations of Clays that have been in office there. There are people of color that have political dynasties across the country. And the only reason I know about the Clays is because, like I said, I'm from St. Louis and they've been in power there for decades. And they they were challenged by Cora Bush, who's in another documentary, Knock Down the House. I literally could have this conversation with you guys for hours because you're really smart, you're really knowledgeable, and I just feel like it's a great conversation that we're having. But the one thing that struck me and really stayed with me after I watched this film was the fact that, Bruce, you and your son at the beginning of the film are talking about August 9th. That's the day that your son was born. That's also the day that Michael Brown was shot. Why did you all collectively decide to start the film with that moment?
I didn't know they was going to start like that. it turned out great.
I think, Carla, one of the themes that we really wanted to explore through the film was the idea of the loss of innocence, especially as it comes to young Black men. And something that Bruce and I talked about early on in one of our very first conversations was when he lost his brother. He was 6 years old. and how transformative that was for him, how that kind of was essentially the end of his childhood. We talked about Mike Brown, and that's a young man whose potential in life was cut short. And for a lot of young people who saw that and who lived through that, whether it was literally on the streets protesting or through the news, not just Mike Brown, but all the people of color who have been killed by police before and after. It's essentially every time you see something like that, it sort of chips away at your childhood. And it's something that we talked to Bruce about a lot in regard to his own son. King is the most pure heart, the most innocent, inquisitive child. And, one of the first questions I asked Bruce, in early days when we were filming was, do you worry about him losing his childhood? Sammy and I discussed it, and we both have kids too, and we are lucky enough to be able to raise our kids essentially in a bubble and preserve that for that. Bruce wasn't so lucky. A lot of kids grow up, in St. Louis and then, other economically distressed communities aren't so lucky. Mike Brown wasn't that lucky. It's something we wanted to explore, and it just so happened, the dates of King's birthday and the day Mike Brown was killed, that became sort of a narrative device, to sort of connect those dots. But the theme was really important to us from the beginning, and hopefully it came across that way in the film.
It certainly did. Just to close it out, I just want to say that I enjoyed this conversation more than anything. I'm so proud of you, Bruce Franks Jr. Thank you for offering to let your life be put on for other people to see you and be inspired by you. Thank you, Smriti Mundra and Sami Khan, for stalking Bruce in order for us to get this story on the screen. And I will see you guys at the AFI Docs Festival, which is playing the 19th through the 23rd in Washington, D.C. So if you guys are in the Washington metro area, please, please, please grab a ticket and go see this. I promise you it will change your life.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.
Bye.